Welcome, everyone, to our Financial Inclusion Week panel, Seeking Shared Incentives, Cultivating Cross-Sector Data Collaboration to Combat the Climate Crisis. Oftentimes, we think of climate data or financial inclusion data in separate terms, but I'm convinced we can learn more about climate and health through financial data, and that there is real value in figuring out how to collaborate across sectors to combat many of the world's problems. We are honored and excited to be part of Financial Inclusion Week's events this year and look forward to providing you with a panel discussion that explores how we can accelerate the adoption of data and tools in financial inclusion for better, faster insights to advance climate preparedness initiatives in low and middle income countries and contexts. My name is Cormiki Whitley. I am the Chief Finance and Administration Officer and Data.org's Financial Inclusion Champion and Subject Matter Expert. And I am thrilled to moderate and introduce you to our woman-led panel with expertise in both climate and financial inclusion. I will pass the mic to Megan to kick us off with short introductions of name, organization, and what brings you to the work. Megan?
Thanks, Cormaki. I'm Megan Dwyer-Bauman. I'm the global lead for qualitative research, and I also lead research efforts in Latin America for Women's World Banking. We are a nonprofit dedicated to women's economic empowerment through financial inclusion for the nearly 1 billion women in the world with no or little access to formal financial services. And our research works then to gather data and evidence of women's use of financial services, then to inform policy advocacy and consultancy for financial services providers. And engaging directly with data holders is key. This is why we're here today. Last year, we convened financial service providers across Latin America to discuss their data and prospective biases that could emerge from the data itself, from their processes and the technology they're using. And incidentally, MasterCard helped us ensure the relevance of this workshop for FSPs, and Data.org has been a strong partner of our work, so it's especially fun to be here with all of you today.
Thank you. Leo?
Thank you. Hello, my name is Leonida, and I'm an entrepreneur and AI researcher based in Nairobi, Kenya. I'm the founder of IntelliPro, where we build and deploy financial management and AI-powered tools to support entrepreneurs access capital and make sustainable and profitable decisions for their businesses. I also lead AI research at the Local Development Research Institute, or LDRI in short, a Nairobi-based think tank that works with governments in Africa in their efforts to end extreme poverty, inequality, and hunger. At LDRI, I lead research, including designing frameworks that support accountable and inclusive AI. And I'm also building an early warning system to support climate smart agricultural practices amongst smallholder farmers in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. And to round out our panelists, Ali?
Thank you, Cormaki. Happy to be here. My name is Ali Schmidt-Fellner. I lead the Insights team at the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, which is the philanthropic hub of MasterCard. Our mission is to advance inclusive growth around the world, and historically we've done that by focusing on financial inclusion, small business growth and resilience, and the role that data science plays in social impact. And more recently, alongside my fellow panelists, our organization has become acutely aware of the intersection of climate change and financial inclusion and helping small businesses navigate, adapt, and become more resilient. And so we've increased our focus on what we're referring to as a portfolio on inclusive climate action. And so looking forward to a conversation today on that.
Great. As you can tell, we have a very esteemed panelists that we have today, and I'm very thankful, along with my colleagues at Data.org, that you each could join us today. As you can tell, each of our panelists touched on all three have experience in the critical intersection of work of financial inclusion and climate. Here at Data.org, both financial inclusion and climate change are key themes in our initiatives grounded in our IDEA, or Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility values, including a gender lens, meaning that we work to ensure that all of our programmatic and capacity building work ensures that women and gender diverse individuals are represented in the data gleaned from the work of data.org. In fact, I would love to bring Megan to the stage and talk a little bit about her work at Women's World Banking. I know that you've just recently published a research agenda on the intersection of climate and women's financial inclusion. Megan, can you start the conversation off today by sharing more about the work that you're doing, but maybe if you can ground us in the why or how do you see climate change and financial inclusion coming together, and how are they tied together?
Thanks, Cormacy. Yes, we just published our research agenda, and it highlights key areas where more data is needed to, one, better evidence the impacts of climate change on women's money management and financial inclusion, and also two, to better direct then efforts and climate-related challenges through financial services and while working towards gender equity and empowerment for women. So to frame our conversation around climate today, I wanted to first be clear that the harmful effects of climate change exacerbate already entrenched inequalities. So whether they're social, economic, or environmental, so communities, households, and individuals who are already marginalized or experiencing disinvestment, these impacts of climate change are going to worsen their situations. And while the climate, scientific community has developed a strong body of evidence quantifying the impacts of climate change on the environment, they've acknowledged in all their work in these key reports like the IPCC reports and others that there really is a need for more evidence and data around how climate change is impacting and will impact low-income women and other marginalized groups. So as an organization specifically focused on women's economic security and prosperity, we're focused on climate data related to finances and financial health among low-income women and their households. So we believe financial inclusion, or the use of formal financial services and tools, is one piece of a very expansive effort needed to support women's resilience as they respond to these challenges. So let me give you two brief examples of some of the women that we've talked to who are experiencing different climate-related stresses. So number one, women living and working in rural areas often have agriculture or natural resources-based work. And in many regions, the effects of climate change are making droughts longer. I know Leo's going to talk about this too, more frequent or intense, and the precipitation patterns that producers have relied upon are changing. And so we want to know things like, how can financial service providers create financing options that work for small-scale solar-powered irrigation systems? What are innovative ways of ensuring smallholder crops against climate-related loss? Can we imagine a financial incentive structure to support women farmers who are shepherding biodiversity resources in their home gardens and their farms? A second example, a woman's family maybe lives near a river that is experiencing repeated or more intense floods linked to a changing climate. And she and her family, after the most recent flood, have to relocate suddenly after the last flood took down their home. So we want to know, how might digital wallets allow her to not worry about the financial logistics of her move? For other climate migrants, as they're being called, how might financial services enable easy online access for them, or sending money to their families more easily, or receiving government-to-person aid payments? So financial services touch so many parts of our daily lives, and we want to make sure that as women are adapting to or building their resilience to climate stresses, that financial inclusion is there as a useful and accessible tool for them and what they need.
Thank you so much for that context, Megan. And just to hone in a little bit more about today's topic of shared incentives and your research, it seems to be that there is a growing concern that stakeholder incentives are not equitable across the zone of impact, and therefore not protecting those in the communities most harshly impacted by climate change. You just mentioned two cases of women and how their livelihood can be impacted by climate change. From your experience and/or insights gleaned from your research, what are some initial steps that can be taken to ensure climate-impacted communities are not only protected, but benefit from financial inclusion initiatives?
I love this question. Thank you. Upfront, let's jump into what we can do. So in a lot of what we're looking at in our research agenda, we also highlight what is being done already and the really great examples that are out. And I know Leo and Emma, or I'm sorry, and Ali are jumping in as well. So I have three things from our work. The first thing is to listen to communities. It takes institutions and stakeholders more time and more resources to do interviews or research with the communities that they want to serve, but they're going to make more effective solutions that way, first listening. And from Women's World Banking, we're always thinking about gender and class, but depending on the geography and the place, there might be other categories of social difference that people need to take into account when they're creating solutions or trying to serve populations and give them what they need. So making sure to think about and collect data on ethnicity, on religion or caste, on ability, age, whatever all these things are, to make sure that we're really serving and meeting different groups of people's needs. So for example, we might look at a low-income area low-income urban area with really intense heat and think, oh, we want to make sure they have cooling systems. But if we talk to people or talk to women there, they actually might prioritize getting better water delivery systems. And so they might want electric scooters. We're working on this now to make deliveries for their home businesses that they're running. So first to listen, and then two, to create and establish this vast network of diverse stakeholders. So often communities experience the most disinvestment, and they're referred to as last mile customers sometimes. They live in areas with limited infrastructure. Perhaps there's a lack of financial capability or resources. Might be in any place social cultural norms that restrict a woman's mobility or her decision-making or agency in finances. So by partnering with local leaders, regional stakeholders, governments, and institutions first, and building that big network, we can make sure that we're creating useful financial solutions for these people experiencing climate stresses. And then finally, to really facilitate those collaborations, to collect and share data on the economic and the environmental impacts that people are experiencing, and ensuring that data can be disaggregated by these types of social difference that might be important in a geography, and then making sure we can share that with other people. And I know that's what we're here to talk about as well.
Thank you, Megan, for that context. I would now like to bring Leo and Ali into the conversation to really talk about those shared incentives. Megan talked about what government needs to play a role, community needs to play a role, and also we're talking about financial inclusion. For, of course, private institutions need to play a role. So Leo, from your experience, from your time at Local Development Research Institute, or your vast experience that you talked about earlier, what really struck you in regard to shared incentives between private sector institutions and the government, and how these incentives have or may impact the communities that they are intent to serve?
Thank you, Komaki, for this question. I want to contextualize my response using the example of our work to support food and nutrition security in Kenya. Right. As I mentioned earlier, we work with governments to eradicate extreme poverty through interventions in food and nutrition security and supporting policies that address inequality in society. So one thing we've observed that shared incentives between the private sector and government tend to have both positive and negative unintended impacts on communities. For instance, in Kenya, agriculture and environmental management are devolved functions of the government, meaning that they are decentralized and run by subnational governments. Now, a number of these local governments have taken steps to mitigate food shortages by providing subsidized agricultural inputs such as seeds and fertilizer, which are often subsidized by grants from multilaterals and donor agencies. These inputs are often sourced also from local and private sector actors operating in these communities, which definitely creates a mutually beneficial relationship because they are also guaranteed by these grants. So on one hand, using these frameworks, the government is able to support good agricultural practices and ensure food and nutrition security, while the private sector is gaining a ready market for their products facilitated by government. However, as with all the government processes, procurement tends to be very political. And so sometimes the procurement of these inputs is influenced by other factors beyond what really the farmers need. So for instance, seeds and fertilizer varieties, may not be suitable for these specific agroecological zones and end up being subsidized over the more appropriate, though very expensive, climate smart varieties. So what we've seen is that smallholder farmers tend to be in these communities will go for the subsidized varieties, which significantly decreases their cost of production. However, they are locked into using inputs that are not appropriate. And so this still leads to persistence in crop failure or crop stress when farmers rely on these poor varieties. So although the programs are well-intentioned, they really end up undermining the very food and nutrition security that the government aims to bolster. So that is why we are also building this early warning system so that we can provide evidence to guide these procurement processes and subsidy programs and ensure that, for instance, our yield predictions and data on crop health stressors throughout a season can ensure the most appropriate and effective agricultural inputs are subsidized and distributed to the farmers who need them. Thanks.
Thank you, Leo, for that context, especially understanding how important procurement and also at times how political forces also play a big factor into that. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I want to come back to you. I do want to bring Allie into the conversation, especially from the perspective of private institutions, specifically around financial inclusion. Allie, can you talk a little bit about that perspective, but also what work MasterCard Center for Inclusion and Growth is doing to ensure that we're not only establishing equitable financial inclusion programs, but also leveraging the climate data to inform these programs that both Megan and Leo talked about a few minutes ago.
Yeah, thanks, Cormeki. So, as I mentioned, our roots at the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth are in financial inclusion, and it's very clear that there's an urgent need to leverage financial inclusion and security to help climate vulnerable populations navigate the shocks and stressors in their communities. And so we're tackling this rather, monumental challenge in three ways. One, we're investing and participating in spaces that bring previously siloed organizations and data sets together to problem solve in new ways. So one example, at COP27 last year, MasterCard joined a call to action by Special Presidential Envoy for Climate John Kerry and USAID for the private sector to draw on its unique resources, which does include data and expertise to support inclusive approaches to climate adaptation. And we've also joined and supported the CFAR Alliance, which is a global cross-sector group that seeks to advance resilient and tech-enabled climate finance solutions that benefit people and the planet. And CFAR's members span financial inclusion organizations, environmental organizations, local entrepreneurs, importantly, investors, and a number of other stakeholders, really stakeholders who haven't historically spoken to each other on this intersectional set of challenges. And this group produces knowledge products together, and in the process gets smarter together and more aligned on how to solve these problems. So that's one approach we've taken. Secondly, we're working to catalyze innovation ecosystems for adaptation and resilience through fintech-enabled solutions. In partnership with the CFAR Alliance, we launched a collab on climate-smart fintech innovation. And through that, we have a gallery of products that showcases existing, and in many cases, early innovations of products and innovations happening around the world on many of the examples that Megan and Leo have referenced, microinsurance, loan products for climate resilient crops and other exciting innovations. And these are in many cases autonomous innovations unlocked by local entrepreneurs rather than government-led. all of which we really need. We're not moving fast enough. And so we need a lot of ideas and collaborations from folks across the ecosystem. And lastly, we're trying to push the frontier of research on climate change and financial inclusion. Megan, really excited to read about the report you all just published. We recently supported an exciting landscape analysis produced by our partners at DataKind on the intersection of data science and inclusive climate finance. And it outlines challenges to achieving inclusive climate finance, which is a fairly new term, and recommends activities for closing gaps and outlines opportunities for solution development, including data science and AI activities.
Thank you for that perspective, both for Leo and Ali. I do want to just move us, and anyone can answer, and maybe we should have a couple different questions on this. What I just heard from all three of you is that this conversation is probably way more complex than what we can handle today in today's conversation. And we need to bring more people to the table, communities, private sector, different areas of financial inclusion, government, nonprofit organization. And we believe that partnership is definitely the way to accomplish some of those things. I do want to just pull back though, right? You talked about what government can do, what private sector can do, what researchers can do. From your perspective, and we'd love to hear from all three of you, what's hindering us from these shared incentives? Why are we not doing a better job of it? Or, push back and tell me that we are. Is it regulation from government? Are the incentives not the right incentives? Are there trade secrets or competitive advantages? Tell me what is holding or hindering us from moving climate and financial inclusion in a way that is beneficial for the globe. Megan, I would like to start with you.
Sure, I'll take a swing at your question in the sense of why businesses should care and why data protection is really important and why institutions should be excited to be talking about these things right now. I think for what we've been seeing in a lot of the emerging markets where we're working, and for those of us too in the US and other markets, that data protection regulation, especially coming to new technology, is still early stage, and governments are trying to figure out how to organize this oversight because it touches on so many of the industries, not only financial industry. And there are notable models that are working on this, and emerging markets are trying to decide which model to follow. And so in that context, the importance of individual company institutions and even an industry level focus on ethics around data protection for us is what we're thinking about. This can't be understated. So companies and industries that refuse to integrate ethical considerations into their innovations from the start, they're going to be at a strong disadvantage for two reasons. So one, they'd have to retrofit their ethics back into the models later, which is much more difficult than building it in at the outset and thinking about data protection. And in the meantime, they'll be open to PR issues, legal challenges, and could develop a poor relationship with the regulator. And then two, companies will have fewer opportunities then to actively influence regulation as it emerges. So this is a really exciting moment where companies and industries that are considering ethics at the very beginning of all of the data protection and sharing conversation, they have a lot of bargaining power in the formation of policy and regulation, and they can show that they're a trusted partner there. So Women's World Banking has been working with companies around the world, incidentally in part because of a generous grant from data.org, to provide financial institutions with the starting point for how we think specifically about gender bias in data protection and algorithms. And we have a check your bias scorecard with 6 easy to measure metrics on which financial institutions can benchmark their current portfolio and figure out where to start, and then how to track progress towards those goals for gender awareness on their team, in their products, and in their approaches to their business.
Leo, I would love to bring you into the conversation. You gave an example around resilient crops, but I believe you was going to get into more around, and I know you also do something in the private sector. Talk a little bit more so the audience understands, some of the hindrances or what should motivate either private or government to play a part in shared incentives?
I would maybe take a jump off where Megan left off in terms of regulation first hindering progress, and then what can be done to move beyond that. So for a long time, data sharing, especially cross-border data sharing from jurisdictions where interventions and technologies are being designed to combat, for instance, the climate crisis. Those flows would be from, lower middle income countries to Western countries, and a number of ethical issues, of course, emerge. And over the last couple of weeks, we just concluded the African Climate Summit, where a number of heads of state made the Nairobi Declaration with a position to compel, nations to pay for the effects of climate change, which includes paying for financial transaction taxes as well as for different emission levels. However, trying to bring that into a very operational perspective requires thinking more about what do these shared infrastructures look like? How do we access the relevant data that supports the innovations that we need to build, or where private sector and government are working together to support climate interventions. And I think regulations, especially around this work, should look at emerging technologies more differently than they have previously. So in as much as we're thinking about data privacy concerns, in as much as we're thinking about data sovereignty and extractive practices concerns, perhaps this is an opportunity to create sandboxes that support experimentation and testing of solutions where real harms to communities can be studied safely and adapted without stifling innovation. So understanding that there's this space where you can innovate without having to directly harm communities or directly start seeing whether the impacts of the collaborations of the innovations have are harmful or are beneficial to communities is a helpful place to begin. But secondly, it's also thinking about the use of digital public infrastructures. So this is shared resources such as open data, ideally, which are good starting points for collaboration, especially where resources are limited. And this DPIs really also start creating frameworks that support the relevant sharing of data from institutions without, let's say, hindering their competitive advantage, but providing like these utilities that can be used across the board to support, that shared collaboration, and then working towards actually solving the climate crisis. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Ali, did you want to also talk about the centers, what they're doing around industry regulation and shared incentives as well?
Happy to comment. I think, Megan and Leo captured a lot of the tensions and challenges really well and pathways forward. I would just say, to reiterate that data sharing between sectors is critical right now, and we need to be moving quickly. Making it more accessible and affordable for local communities is critical. But of course, we need to balance that with doing it in a responsible way. And so MasterCard has a set of 7 data responsibility principles that guide all of our activities. And there's really 2 buckets there. One is thinking about how to best protect individuals, upholding best-in-class security and privacy, keeping the individual at the center, and then how we act as responsible stewards of data and technology. So transparency is key. We have an opt-in rather than opt-out approach to data collection. Clear and simple explanations of how we collect, use, and share an individual's data and give individuals the ability to control its use. And then it's inclusive, embrace diversity in all its forms to enable data practices, analytics, and outputs that are inclusive, comprehensive, and equitable.
Thank you for that, Ali. I think you moved us right into the direction of want to talk more about ethical concerns when sharing climate data across industry or even financial inclusion, which I'm very passionate about. Leo, you also talked about some of the ethical concerns. Can you lift up what some of these ethical concerns could be, and where does a conversation need to go in order to ensure regulation doesn't impede progress, right? We definitely have some ethical concerns. We all talked about those, but we also want to make sure that we're moving in a direction that's best for people that are impacted by climate the most, and also who are locked out of some of the systems. Can you talk about where ideally we need to have conversations and where they need to go to start a positive progress?
Thank you, Komeki. I would potentially talk about the specific ethical concerns that arise from data, especially data that's extracted, for instance, through activities such as Earth observation, and which is very helpful for either designing climate innovation such as climate resilient agriculture, as well as even carbon credits, etc. And what we found is that a lot of the issues arising also tend to hinge on national security issues as well as data sovereignty of communities. So the communities that are most impacted by climate change are the ones that are expected to, provide this data to support some of these activities, especially in the form of ground truth data. But many communities are seeing that this data being extracted from their systems sometimes tends to be without proper consent, and the benefits are not immediately seen to these communities. And so even as our efforts to ensure local communities are included in the data, are included in the systems, we forget that the data infrastructures in place are likely still to exploit their natural resources and overlook indigenous knowledge. Therefore, that's why I still posit again that really thinking through these ideas of sandboxes and regulation sort of freeholds that support experimentation, and designing of innovations without necessarily immediately impacting communities is very important, because ethical issues around bias, issues around exclusion and marginalization are arrested beforehand, before the communities are directly impacted. But at the same time, it also provides an opportunity for different stakeholders to start thinking about how do we ensure that the shared benefits from these innovations actually do impact communities immediately and not turn into extractive processes.
Thank you for that, Leo. Ali, I would like to also bring you back into the conversation. Earlier, you talked about that MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth is part of quite a few groups and partnerships that are trying to think about financial inclusion and climate crisis. Where do you see the conversation needing to go specifically in the private sector, financial area? We'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Cormackie. Well, I'd love to build on Leo's points just now, about bringing communities who are most affected into the conversation, particularly when it comes to data. Whenever we talk about data collaboration, we think about the very beginning of the data pipeline. So the data collection, where it's crucial to center local voices and ensure the data is accurate, complete, protected. That can mean data literacy and data analysis skills. It can also mean investing in infrastructure to store, transform, and safeguard data that may be turned into insights that empower local communities. And I just want to offer one great example of an entrepreneur in this space that is both connected to the CFAR Alliance's Catalyst Fund. That's an accelerator. They're also a recent winner of the Earthshot Prize, a finalist for the Earthshot Prize 2023. And that's Abelobi, which is a South African social enterprise and mobile app that empowers small-scale fishers by providing tools for sustainable fishing, catch data recording, traceability, market access, and community engagement. And it promotes sustainable fisheries management and helps fishers improve their livelihoods while fostering transparency in the seafood supply chain. And so I just think this is where we need to be going, is putting data in the hands of local communities and finding those innovators who are going to unlock that at the local level.
Thank you for that. Personally, I believe everything, I'm a big proponent that those affected by the problem should be part of the solution. Leo, you talked about that. Ali, you just talked quite a bit about that. But that being said, Megan, I would love to bring you into the conversation for two reasons. One, I know that you do a lot of work around women in this area. Talk a bit about how you bring women into that. And also from another perspective, Leo or Ali, you can also jump into the conversation. Who do you see is not at the table talking about this readily? First, Megan, and then I'll open it up to Leo and Ali.
Sure, thanks. I was thinking a lot in hearing Leo and Ali's responses to that. At the data collection level, regulation can really support good data collection. So at least at like the government level or at a regional policy level, defining what data is collected and what data is required to be reported, those are really powerful decisions. And so making sure that, again, they're like representative voices in the room making those decisions, to make sure that household level data isn't necessarily collected, but that data, if you enter a household in many places of the world, the man there is going to give the data and give the information. And so making sure that, again, for us, like women's voices are included in data on women is included there, and not only of that. So thinking about like the level of data collected to make sure everyone's represented. But then also we think a lot about the workforce, and we do a lot of research on gender equity in different financial industries. So we would need to make sure that women are represented and not left out in not only the data collected, but in analyzing it. So in some of the markets we've recently been working in, we did like a really quick kind of view in LinkedIn of digital credit companies operating in East Africa, which has like a lot of kind of Silicon Valley startups. And there we found that like a lot of the data scientists working in these companies were university graduates, a lot of them from California and a lot of them men. And so we need like women to be working in data, and making sure that we're thinking about biases, not only in the data that's going into our problems and the analysis, but how that's also influencing like all the algorithms that we're working with now in our world. So making sure the data going in is good, making sure that we have representative people working with the data and like making conclusions from it. We need like a really diverse workforce.
Thank you. Leo or Ali, did you want to jump in and talk about who's missing from today's conversation globally about shared data?
Definitely. I would want to maybe center back to grassroots communities. A lot of the decisions made, especially when we think about financial inclusion, as well as addressing the climate crisis, really are solutions made at a global level to be implemented at a local level. And so representatives of these local communities that are actually supposed to either adopt the climate mitigation strategies or climate adaptation strategies tend to be missing from the table, and are so their resources are extracted from them, but they are not represented and do not have a say on how these resources will be utilized. I'll give the example of the smallholder farmers, for instance, we're working with. We try to, in as much as possible, include them in the design of the innovations we're building for artificial intelligence, that we actually include their indigenous knowledge, because they already have mitigation strategies going on now. we need to include that indigenous knowledge in the design of the systems, but also in the data that trains the models. And so, but beyond including that indigenous knowledge is thinking about how do we grant them ownership of those data sets and those resources, and how do they benefit from it? What are those incentives for them to participate in this global conversation? So I would think that it's just right that their voices are included, and not in a representative, passive manner, but actively working with partners across the board, both national governments, global institutions, but also private sector who are designing solutions that will eventually impact them.
All right, thank you. Ali, I do just want to give you space in case you wanted to. You started the conversation off around who's missing, but do want to give you an opportunity to chime in around who you believe is missing from today's conversation, or who have you seen come to the conversation recently?
Yeah, I again, Megan and Leo articulated what I would have said really well. So just a +1 to both of you on how it's so complex to figure out how to bring local communities into this, and it is where our focus should be. So I won't belabor that because it was articulated so well for my other panelists. I do think I wanted to share one, solution we're trying out to kind of get there. Not a perfect solution, but getting there, which is this notion of a climate hackathon in a local community. And we've tried a couple out, one in Cape Town and one in Bogota, where we invite students, entrepreneurs, leaders in fintech in their communities, leaders who are in government at the forefront of climate resilience for their city, and really crowdsourcing ideas that lean on expertise from across that space. And it's been really exciting to see either collaborations come together that wouldn't have otherwise, or new ideas seeded, but really starting a conversation at the local level and acknowledging that city context is just one, but we could take this to different rural areas or otherwise peri-urban. And so really excited to see how we can bring, scale that model and apply it elsewhere.
Thank you for that. And I just think the conversation around who's at the table, who should be at the table is so rich and depends on localization. You talked about local language. We talked about bringing different perspectives at the city, local, and the federal level, and how we bring in different perspectives around gender, and how all those nuances mean so much to the data, because you can glean so much from that, from your perspective and what you know about what's happening on the ground. Like I said, we could probably talk about this for days on end, but I do know that we are coming to our end time for this webinar. So thank you so much for being with us here today. And thank you to everyone who is tuning in virtually. Before we leave, I do want to just invite you to use the chat function on our session page to pose questions and share your thoughts on today's discussion. We will also post polls on our session page throughout Financial Inclusion Week that we encourage you to answer. But before we leave you today, I would like to turn it back over to each of our panelists to share some final thoughts by answering one last question. What is one thing we can do in the next year to cultivate cross-sector data collaboration to combat the climate crisis? Ali, since I ended with you, I'll start with you, and then I will go to Megan and then end with Leo.
Look, I would just say, if there's anything we've learned over the past year and a half that we've been involved in this intersectional conversation, it's still really nascent, and bringing these perspectives together, there's a lot of work to be done. So I would just encourage participants to not hesitate to join these conversations, and know that they actually do have a role to play and something to offer, and to dive into a project or contribute to a project through one of these forums that we've mentioned, like the CFAR Alliance, where you can sort of build knowledge products and learn from each other together. We're all learning and problem solving together. And we really need new ideas, new approaches, and partnerships between organizations that care about climate resilience and low income and vulnerable people.
Thank you. Megan?
Thanks. Yeah, the conversation around the climate crisis is just accelerating. More and more people rightly and should be joining it. And our data systems, especially those that represent the end beneficiaries of climate adaptation and a lot of mitigation strategies, those data systems haven't kept up with the conversation yet. And we know a lot more today about climate science, and we know a lot about the macroeconomic consequences. But for us, the microeconomic stories of the experiences of low-income populations, there's not as much data on that, and neither individually nor in aggregate. So in orienting ourselves and sharing that thinking externally, Women's World Banking published this research agenda, and it articulates some of the things that we as a team and organization don't yet know about climate's impact on low-income women, and data that we want to have. And also articulates hypotheses that we have about how financial services providers, like banks, insurance companies, fintechs that we've talked about, payments companies, and others can meaningfully play a role in supporting communities' adaptation to climate change. So thanks so much for having us here today, Cormac.
Thank you. Leo, want to round us out?
I get to have the final say. The conversations around data sharing, especially across sectors, across industries to support climate change, but also financial inclusion, is very nuanced and needs to be inclusive. And being very literal about this, I think we need to seed support for the production of these inclusive data sets and by local researchers or local actors, but also thinking about frameworks around data sharing in a manner that promotes sustainable reuse of data sets that have already been collected for specific purposes. And this is where conversations around DPGs, digital public goods, can really accelerate in the course of a year on how we can create sustainable infrastructures for supporting the opening up and the sharing of data sets that could be adapted for new uses, such as combating financial inclusion and this intersection with the climate crisis conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's a wrap on our data.org on-demand shared incentive panel. Thank you again to Ali, Megan, and Leo for your insights, and also really challenging all of us to be part of that community that thinks about how financial inclusion and the climate crisis is all part of our responsibility. Thank you all for tuning in, and please leave your thoughts on our session page. Thank you.